This recording came about when Joe, Dickie and I were talking to Kent Vlieger and Shane Jordan on a podcast specifically about salinity. I asked Kent a little bit about the data that he had from the Cain Creek project. He had some data from 2015 right through 2023, and when I saw it, I was really excited about it. It's interesting, the first time I saw that data was in 2022 when I visited Kent, and he happened to have had this table open on his desk, and I started looking at these numbers and I went, wow, incredible. It was a 100-fold decrease in electrical conductivity and sodium adsorption ratio. Absolutely phenomenal. Kent, why don't you just talk a little bit about the demo reclamation plot that you've had? Joe alluded to this a little bit earlier in the podcast.
Sure. So this, what we're looking at here is basically soil testing data from Cain Creek, which is a demonstration ranch/farm that's owned by the Beadle Conservation District in South Dakota. And they had a roughly 15-acre field that had just been in pretty typical crop production for many years, just kind of managed as a food plot, but really put under traditional crops. And so it had developed salinity over a number of years, just like many fields throughout the James River Valley. And it's interesting to look at aerial imagery and just kind of see that salinity go from nothing, and in fact, those areas being very productive, to over a matter of a few years being so severely saline and sodic that nothing is even germinating in those areas. But in 2015, we planted it to a pretty simple mix, really, of a hybrid wheatgrass called AC Saltlander, and then a salt-tolerant alfalfa. And this is one of those examples where the timing on this really, as you look at these numbers, drop quickly and kind of almost unbelievably. We got lucky with timing, to be honest, but if we hadn't planted this to a perennial system, we wouldn't have been able to take advantage of it. But 2015, if you look, that was the year that we planted that perennial mix, and the EC in the top 4 to 6 inches was really quite high, 31. And if you have an EC of 4, we consider that to be saline. So it was really just off the charts. And even the SAR, the sodium adsorption ratio, which is a measure of sodicity, was high. And so we kind of had that double whammy of saline and sodic soils. But we had good establishment. The alfalfa did not germinate within the highest salinity areas. But the AC Saltlander we found to be really quite resilient and tough. It germinated in most of the saline areas, even some of the hottest areas or the most saline areas. And so so this is just kind of a story of the numbers, and you can just look throughout the years. And for myself, I kind of know the history of precipitation in there, so some of these numbers really make sense, and I'll try and explain those. But year 1, we had those high saline areas, high saline numbers. Even year 2, you look at it, we got the vegetation to establish, but our salinity is still high and sodicity is still really high. And so that was 2016. Most people that were living in this area would know that 2016 was a drought year. We had wet conditions early on, but then very dry through the rest of the summer and into fall. And then so you look at the following year, 2017, those numbers just drop wildly. The EC drops down to 8, which is still relatively high for salinity, and the sodicity drops to 9. So just a huge drop in numbers. Almost some people would question and say it's unrealistic, but we had that vegetation established. Alfalfa is a high water user. The grass was growing in those saline areas and using water. It was a dry year. And so really what's happening is we're sucking that soil profile dry through that perennial vegetation. And then anytime we would...
Yeah, let me just interrupt. So just for context again, the electrical conductivity was 31, and the SAR was also 31. And basically both of those dropped down to 8.7 and 9.2 respectively. So they were down just in the space of 2 years to a quarter of what they were when you started out. And that's what you're talking about being unbelievable, correct?
Yes, that's exactly. Yep. Thanks for clarifying that, Buzz. So they really dropped quite fast, which I would caution producers probably is not going to be typical, although it can obviously happen. But like I said, we got the vegetation established. We had a dry year. Anytime that rain was coming, it was infiltrating into the profile and moving those salts back down lower where they belong and should be. And then so as the years go on, those numbers keep on dropping. By year 4, our sodicity is now below the threshold for what we consider to be sodic. The salinity is still right at 4.5, so just over that saline level. But then by 2019, the numbers really drop to below both levels, really where we could, if we wanted to, we could probably put row crops back in those areas and get production. But 2019 was a really wet year, record-setting precipitation. And then so what you'll see is in 2020, those numbers tick back up. And so, you know, while that's concerning and it's not something that we want to see, it's to be expected because with that heavy rainfall in 2019, it raised the water table. And then 2020, we kind of had heavy precipitation earlier on, but then it was otherwise average to a little bit drier. And so those salts kind of with the higher water table, they're closer to the surface. They got to the water, they got to those top 6 inches again, and raised the EC to above that level of 4. Sodicity still stayed relatively low, however. But then 2021 rolls around and we're dry. And so we've got all that perennial vegetation using the water in the soil profile. Anytime we get rain, it's moving that water down the profile again. And then our EC values drop, and they've maintained that low level down to below 1, even below 0.5. And now this year we're at 0.2 for EC and 0.4 for our sodium absorption ratio. So really,
that's roughly 100-fold decrease in your salinity and sodicity, 100-fold decrease.
Yep, over an 8-year period. So this may not be 100% typical. Our saline areas are on the smaller side. It's roughly 10% of this field, but it is pretty typical to see those smaller areas throughout the James River Valley that you have these salinity-affected areas. You get up towards Shane's neck of the woods in Redfield, up towards Aberdeen, you can have larger 40, 50, 100-acre spots. I would not call that typical for this type, but I wouldn't expect those results on those larger areas, but for producers that have smaller areas, I think you could get these faster results.
The reason I want to make this video public now is because Kent has hard data, over 9 years. And also it's fall. If you're trying to tackle salinity, or if you want to show a friend or a neighbor, or if you want to show a landlord, now's the time to do it because we're planning for 2025. And this hard data that Kent presents to us gives us a good reason for why we should make that first step to tackle salinity.